The dust of the Kandahar airfield tasted of rust and regret. It clung to the back of the throat, a permanent grit that no amount of rationed water could wash away. For Captain Katerina Rostova, callsign Sparrow, it was the taste of purpose. She stood in the pre-dawn chill, a lone figure dwarfed by the machine at her side. The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II was not a thing of beauty. It was an instrument of brutal necessity, and in the pale light it looked less like an aircraft and more like a prehistoric beast dredged from a tar pit. Its official name was a mouthful. The pilots of the sleeker, faster F-16s, the Viper jocks who shared this flight line, but not her world, called it the Warthog. They said it with a faint sneer, a joke about its ugliness, its slowness, its stubborn refusal to be anything other than what it was, a flying gun platform designed to protect the soldiers on the ground. Katerina, however, never used the nickname. To her, this machine of titanium and depleted uranium was a sanctuary. It was her guardian. Her gloved hand ran along the riveted fuselage, a ritualistic caress. The metal was cold, humming with a latent power that resonated deep in her bones. She knew every seam, every stubborn bolt, every scar left by shrapnel from forgotten skirmishes over forgotten hills. This was intimacy. It was a language spoken not in words, but in vibrations, in the smell of JP-8 fuel, and in the low guttural whine of the auxiliary power unit spinning to life. She walked the perimeter of the aircraft, her eyes scanning her movements, economical and precise. Left main landing gear tires checked struts clean. 7-barreled GAU-8 Avenger cannon recessed in the nose. She paused here for a moment longer than procedure required. It was the heart of the beast, the reason for its existence. 30 millimeters of judgment delivered at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. It did not roar. It tore the sky apart. Her instructors had called it brrrr-t. The grunts on the ground called it the sound of God's own anger. Katerina saw it differently. It was the sound of a promise kept. Finishing her walk-around, she saw them. Across the tarmac near the briefing hangar stood a small cluster of men. They were not Air Force. Their uniforms were a different shade of camouflage, faded and worn in ways that spoke of long days spent motionless, observing the earth. Their gear was lean, functional, stripped of anything non-essential. They moved with a quiet, predatory grace, their gazes constantly sweeping the perimeter. Special Forces, a sniper team. Her eyes met for a fleeting second with their leader. He was taller than the others, his face a mask of sun-weathered fatigue carved into hard lines. A thick beard, non-regulation, but tolerated, obscured his mouth, leaving only his eyes to betray any emotion. They were the color of slate, and they looked at her and the A-10 beside her with a dispassionate, analytical coolness. It wasn't hostility. It was assessment. He was weighing her worth the same way he would weigh the wind before a shot. She knew his file. Sergeant Lars Hauk. Callsign Grim. A man who trusted only his spotter, his rifle, and the dirt under his fingernails. Air support to men like him was a necessary evil. A voice on the radio, a distant shadow, a force too remote and impersonal to be fully trusted. She was an abstraction, a set of coordinates, a potential for friendly fire. Katerina gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of professional acknowledgement that asked for nothing in return. He did not nod back. His gaze simply shifted away back to his men, dismissing her. She felt the familiar sting of isolation. It wasn't about being a woman. There were other female pilots on base flying transport planes, or even the coveted Vipers. It was about her and her machine. The fighter jocks saw themselves as knights of the modern age jousting in the stratosphere. She was a trench digger with wings, and to the men on the ground, she was a stranger. Climbing the ladder into the cockpit, she sealed the canopy, and the world outside muted. The cacophony of the airfield, the whine of turbines, the shouts of ground crews faded into a dull hum. Here, in the cramped, armor-plated bathtub of a cockpit, she was no longer an outsider. She was a component. She was the brain, and the Warthog was the body. She strapped herself in the clicks of the buckles echoing in the sudden stillness. Her fingers danced across the control panels, flipping switches, running diagnostics, the muscle memory so ingrained it felt like breathing. The final green light flickered on her console. She was ready. Through the armored glass, she saw Sergeant Hawk's team loading into a helicopter. Their mission was hers now, too. She was their guardian whether they wanted one or not. The sky was hers to command, but the ground, the patch of dirt they would fight and bleed on, was all that mattered. The inside of the HH-60 Pavehawk was a world of controlled chaos. The rhythmic, gut-shaking thump-thump-thump of the rotor blades was a physical presence, a constant pressure on the chest. The air smelled of hydraulic fluid, hot metal, and the faint, salty tang of 4 men's sweat. Seated on the nylon webbing, their bodies swaying in unison with the helicopter's movements, was Sergeant Lars Hauk's reconnaissance sniper team. They were islands of stillness in the turbulent sea of noise and vibration. Lars, grim, sat nearest the open door, his custom-built M110 rifle held securely across his lap. His gaze was fixed on the blur of rock and sand rushing past below the jagged teeth of the Zagros mountain range. He wasn't admiring the view. He was reading it. He noted the deep ravines that could hide an ambush, the sheer cliff faces that offered perfect overwatch positions, the subtle changes in terrain that could mean life or death. His world was measured in meters, in wind speed, in the time it took a 7.62mm round to cross a valley. Beside him, Corporal Elias Vance, his spotter tapped at a ruggedized tablet strapped to his forearm. Elias' call sign, Scribe, for his meticulous note-taking and calm demeanor, was the team's anchor to the digital world. On his screen, a topographical map glowed. 4 friendly icons his team pulsed in the center. High above them, a single separate icon, an aircraft symbol, traced a lazy circular path. It was labeled Sparrow 1. Partho. Elias said, his voice raised just enough to be heard over the rotors. It's a delicate name. Lars didn't turn his head. His eyes remained on the landscape. It's a name, Scribe, nothing more. For a Warthog pilot, though, Elias pressed gently. You'd expect something like Hammer or Breaker, Sparrow. It flies in the face of the machine. Maybe that's the point, mumbled the team's heavy weapons specialist, a bull of a man named Petrov from across the bay. He was checking the feed on his M240 Bravo, his movements slow and deliberate. Lars finally shifted his gaze from the earth to his spotter. The name doesn't matter. The pilot's sight picture does. The only thing that matters is whether they can tell the difference between our heat signature and the enemy's when we're 10 meters apart. He let the statement hang in the vibrating air. It wasn't a criticism, but a statement of fact, a fundamental law of his universe. He had seen air support work miracles, and he had heard stories whispered in hushed tones of pilots who had mistaken shadows for threats and turned comrades to ash. Trust was not given. It was forged in fire, and this Sparrow was an unknown quantity. He thought of the pilot's file. Rostova Katerina. A clean record. Top of her class in A-10 training. High marks in precision engagement. The data was impeccable. But data wasn't the same as instinct. Data couldn't account for the split-second moral calculus of a danger-close fire mission when the fate of men on the ground rested on a single trigger pull thousands of feet in the air. She sees a grid square. Lars set his voice low again, almost speaking to himself. She sees a 10-digit coordinate on a screen. Down here we see the color of the rock our brother is bleeding behind. It's a different war. The fourth man on the team, the communications specialist, known only as Echo, gave a thumbs up to the crew chief. They were 5 minutes from the insertion point. The men began their final checks, the quiet, practiced rituals of soldiers preparing to step outside the wire. Magazines were seated with the firm tap straps were tightened, optics were wiped clean. The Pave Hawk banked sharply, descending into a narrow, winding valley that would shield them from radar. The temperature dropped, and the wind whipped into the open cabin, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. Lars chambered around the sound, a sharp, definitive click that cut through the engine's roar. He looked up through the space between the rotor blades at the empty, indifferent blue of the sky. He knew she was up there somewhere, a metal bird with a delicate name watching over them with an electronic eye. An angel or a variable he didn't know yet. The helicopter flared for landing, hovering just a few feet above a rocky plateau. The crew chief slapped the side of the door. Go, go, go. Lars needed no encouragement. He swung his legs out and dropped to the ground, his boots crunching on loose gravel. His team followed in a fluid, silent motion. Within seconds they had fanned out, disappearing into the shadows of the rocks. The Pave Hawk ascended, its noise fading until it was just another whisper on the wind. They were alone. Or not quite. High above, unseen, the Warthog's guardian began a new, tighter orbit. For 6 hours, the world for Lars and Elias was the size of a rifle scope. They lay prone on a sun-baked ridge concealed by a screen of shale and withered alpine shrubs. Below them, a dusty compound, nothing more than a few mud-brick buildings sprawled in the heat haze. Their mission was simple, yet infinitely complex: watch record, and remain invisible. Lars's breathing was slow, and even a conscious act of control, his eye pressed to the powerful optic of his rifle, not to shoot, but to see. Elias lay beside him, whispering observations into a small recorder, his spotting scope sweeping the area in methodical arcs. The call came without warning, a clipped, urgent whisper over their internal comms. It was Echo. Grim, we have movement. 2 o'clock your position. Patrol. 6 men. Closing on us. Lars didn't move a muscle, but his entire being went on high alert. He scanned the coordinates in his mind. The patrol had stumbled into the dead ground below their ridge, putting them on a direct path to the rear security position held by Petrov and Echo. Engaging them with rifle fire was suicide. The sound would give away their primary location and compromise the entire operation. This was a scalpel problem, not a sledgehammer one. My scribe, Lars, said, his voice a low rumble. Wake the Sparrow. Elias was already on it, switching frequencies on his radio handset. His voice was the epitome of calm as he transmitted. Sparrow 1, this is Grim Actual. Request immediate fire mission. How copy? The reply was instantaneous, shockingly clear, and devoid of any emotion. It was like listening to a synthesized voice. Solid copy, Grim Actual. Stand by for 9 line. High above, in the sterile chill of her cockpit, Katarina's view of the world was a canvas of muted greens and ghostly whites. The men on the ground were tiny, insignificant heat signatures against the cooler backdrop of the earth. When the call came, her heart rate didn't even flicker. This was the cold state of flow she sought, a place where emotion was a liability and procedure was salvation. She listened as Elias read the coordinates, the target description, and the proximity of friendly forces, the critical danger close advisory. Friendlies are 100 meters west of target grid. Elias's voice confirmed. I repeat, 100 meters west. Copy 100 meters west. Katerina repeated, her fingers flying across her console. She input the data, and a small red diamond appeared on her targeting pod display. 6 warm smudges moved near it. The enemy patrol. A green circle representing the friendly position pulsed nearby. The margin for error was slim, but acceptable. Sparrow 1 is inbound. Cleared hot. On the ground, Lars and Elias pressed themselves flat against the rock. All Grim elements stand by for ordnance, Lars commanded into his mic. 30 seconds. Those 30 seconds stretched into an eternity. This was the moment of absolute faith, the transfer of responsibility from the men on the ground to the unseen weapon in the sky. It was the part of his job Lars hated the most. Katerina banked the A-10, the heavy aircraft, responding with a sluggish grace. She ignored the horizon, focusing entirely on the symbology projected onto her helmet's visor. Altitude airspeed vector. She lined up the Pipper with the red diamond on her screen. She could feel the immense power coiled beneath her, the impatient energy of the Avenger cannon. Sparrow rolling in, she transmitted, her voice steady. The first sign on the ground was not a sight, but a sound. A faint hum that grew with terrifying speed into a low, menacing snarl. It was the sound of the sky being ripped open. Lars clenched his jaw as the Warthog materialized, a gray specter hugging the terrain far lower than he'd expected. It was huge, ugly, and magnificent. In the cockpit, Katerina squeezed the trigger. The aircraft shuddered violently as the GAU-8 came to life. For 2 brutal seconds, a torrent of 30mm rounds, each the size of a milk bottle, spewed from the nose of the plane. The sound in the cockpit was all-consuming, a deafening, visceral roar that vibrated through the armored bathtub and up her spine. On her screen, the area around the red diamond erupted into 1,000 points of light as the incendiary rounds struck home. On the ground, the world dissolved into thunder. The brrrt of the cannon was a physical force that hammered the air, shaking the very rock they lay on. The ground where the patrol had been walking was shredded, pulverized into a cloud of dust and red mist. Then, as quickly as it began, there was silence. The Warthog was already climbing, banking away, its roar fading once more. Petrov's voice came over the comms, breathless. Target destroyed. We are clear. Katerina's voice followed a moment later, as cool and remote as before. Good effect on target, Grim actual. Sparrow 1 is RTB. Any further tasking? Lars took a slow breath, the smell of burnt cordite sharp in his nostrils. He keyed his mic. Negative, Sparrow. Solid copy. Out. He didn't say thank you. It wasn't in their lexicon. But as he watched the dark cross of the A-10 dissolve into the shimmering heat of the sky, he felt the first crack in his professional skepticism. The Sparrow was no ghost. She was a Reaper, and her aim was perfect. The summons came separately through encrypted channels, directing them to a location on the base few ever entered. The Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, or SCIF, was a windowless box of concrete and steel designed to be impervious to both bombs and electronic eavesdropping. The air inside was unnaturally cold, recycled and sterile, smelling faintly of ozone from the humming servers. It was a place where futures were decided and grim necessities were laid bare. When Lars and his team entered, they saw her immediately. Captain Katerina Rostova was already there, standing alone, her flight suit, a slash of dark green against the room's pale gray walls. She stood with the ramrod posture of a pilot, a discipline of the spine that seemed to defy gravity. Her presence was a surprise, but Lars's face betrayed nothing. He and his men took seats at the long, polished table, their movements economical, their silence a stark contrast to the casual banter of the fighter pilots who usually occupied these chairs. Katarina's eyes met Lars's for a moment. There was no warmth in the glance, only a cool, professional assessment that mirrored his own. She saw the man from the tarmac, the leader of the men whose lives she had held in her hands for 2 perfect seconds a week ago. He saw the pilot whose disembodied voice had been the calm in the storm. They were strangers, yet they were already bound by the unique intimacy of combat. A curt nod was exchanged, a silent acknowledgement of a shared, unspoken history. The door hissed shut, and Wing Commander Colonel Davies entered. He was a lean, hawk-faced man whose calm demeanor did little to hide the intensity of his gaze. He wasted no time on pleasantries, placing a slim data slate on the table. A holographic map of the Zargos range sprang to life above it, glowing in the dim light. "Good evening," Davies began, his voice filling the sterile room. "This briefing is classified top secret. What is said in this room does not leave it. Ever." He let the weight of that sink in before continuing. "For the last 6 months, intelligence has been hunting a ghost, an insurgent leader named Suleiman al-Qanuni. He is the strategist, the financier, and the spiritual head of the entire insurgency in this province. He is the head of the snake." He zoomed the map in on a jagged, isolated valley deep in enemy territory. "We believe we have found his nest. This valley is a natural fortress, accessible by only one pass and frequently subject to extreme, unpredictable weather systems. We cannot send a conventional force." Davies looked directly at Lars. "Sergeant Hauk, your team is tasked with Operation Serpent's Tooth. This is not a kill or capture mission. Your sole objective is positive identification. You will infiltrate on foot, establish an observation post, and acquire definitive visual proof that Al-Qanuni is at this location. You will observe, you will report, and you will not engage unless compromised." Lars nodded, his expression unreadable. It was a classic, high-risk, low-footprint reconnaissance mission. The kind his team excelled at. The kind that got men killed. Then Colonel Davies turned his gaze to Katarina. "Captain Rostova, you are their support." He paused, letting the simple statement land. "Their only support. To maintain the lowest possible electronic signature, there will be no drone overwatch. The operational ceiling and weather patterns in that valley make F-16s unsuitable for the kind of low and slow support this mission may require. If Sergeant Hawk's team gets into trouble, you are their only way out." The air in the room grew colder, heavier. This changed everything. Standard procedure and sanity dictated layers of redundancy: drones, gunships, a quick reaction force on standby. Stripping all of that away left them utterly exposed. Lars felt a knot tighten in his gut. His team's survival, a thing he controlled with meticulous planning and ruthless discipline, was now tethered to a single engine, a single airframe, a single pilot. Katarina's composure remained flawless, but she felt a new weight settle onto her shoulders. This was not a reactive fire mission anymore. This was a covenant. The lives of those 4 men were now her direct and sole responsibility from the moment they stepped off the helicopter. There was no backup. There was no one else to call. The infiltration window is 36 hours from now, dependent on a forecast break in the weather. Davies concluded, his eyes shifting between the sergeant on the ground and the captain of the air. "Your fates will be linked. Success depends on your mutual trust and flawless execution." "Are there any questions?" Silence. "No, sir," Lars said, his voice flat. "No, sir," Katarina echoed, her tone matching his. The briefing was over. As they filed out of the CIF, back into the warm, dusty air of the base, Katerina and Lars passed in the narrow corridor. They stopped for a half-second, the shared pressure of the mission creating a tangible field between them. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw not a pilot, but the woman who now held the lives of his men in her hands. She saw not a soldier, but the man whose skill and discipline were all that stood between her and an impossible choice. No words were spoken, none were needed. They turned and walked their separate ways, the weight of Operation Serpent's Tooth settling upon them like a shroud. Twilight bled across the Zargos range, painting the jagged peaks in hues of bruised purple and cold iron. The Pavehawk held its position for less than a minute, a brutal intrusion of noise and wind before lifting away and vanishing into the deepening gloom. It left behind a silence so profound, it felt like a physical weight. For Lars and his team, the mission had truly begun. They were now foreign bodies in a hostile organism miles from any friendly line. The air was thin here and bit with a wind that carried the promise of a deeper cold to come. They moved without words, a language of hand signals and shared glances honed over years of operating together. Lars took the point, his rifle held low, his senses stretched to their absolute limit. Every gust of wind could be a whispered voice, every shadow a waiting enemy. This was their craft, to move through the land not as conquerors, but as ghosts, leaving no trace of their passing. They followed the spine of a narrow ridge, keeping to the shadows, cast by the setting sun. The ground was treacherous, a loose scree of shale that threatened to betray them with every step. Below the valley floor was a dark, uninviting maw. This was a place that did not welcome men. Periodically, Lars would stop, sinking to one knee and scanning the vast emptiness above. The first stars were beginning to prick the darkening canopy. He could see nothing, hear nothing but the wind. Yet he knew she was there. Captain Rostova. Sparrow. A single circling predator, a guardian angel encased in 2,000 pounds of titanium armor. The knowledge was a strange comfort, a thin thread of security in this overwhelmingly hostile place. But it was also unsettling. His team's survival depended on a machine and a pilot so far removed from his reality that she might as well have been on the moon. She was an idea, a voice on the radio, an abstract promise of firepower. 15,000 feet above him, Katerina saw the world not as rock and shadow, but as a shifting tapestry of thermal energy. In her high-tech bubble, the wind didn't bite. It was a number on her airspeed indicator. The ground was not treacherous. It was a topographical map on her central display. Lars Hauk's team was not 4 men fighting for each step, but 4 bright white signatures of life crawling with painstaking slowness across her screen. Her flight path was a long, lazy oval, a racetrack pattern that kept her sensors focused on the team's area of operations, without her becoming a predictable target. The task required immense discipline. It was hours of monotony punctuated by moments of sheer terror. For now it was monotony. The sun dipped below the horizon, and her world became the ghostly green and black of her night vision systems. The 4 signatures glowed with reassuring warmth. She was their overwatch, a distant, all-seeing eye. She sipped recycled water from a tube, her gaze never leaving the screens. She felt the profound disconnect of her role. She was close enough to obliterate any threat to them in seconds, yet she could not know if they were cold or tired or afraid. She was a guardian, but a remote one, her power immense, but her comfort intangible. She was a god in the machine, and just as distant. A flicker of movement on the ground drew Lars's fist up in a sharp, silent command. The team froze, melting into the terrain until they were indistinguishable from the rocks. Elias focused his spotting scope. On a parallel ridge nearly a kilometer away, a lone figure was silhouetted against the last of the light. A shepherd, perhaps, or a sentry. The figure stood motionless for a long minute, looking out over the valley. The four men on the ground held their breath. Lars's thumb rested on the transmit button of his radio. The thread connecting him to the sky felt suddenly desperately thin. He knew that one panicked call could end the mission, but a moment's hesitation could end his team. In her cockpit, Katerina noticed nothing amiss. The four friendly signatures remained stationary, clustered together as they should be. No other heat sources were in the immediate vicinity. To her, all was calm. Her hand rested on the throttle, her mind focused on maintaining her altitude and airspeed, a silent promise circling in the dark. After an eternity, the figure on the distant ridge turned and walked away, disappearing over the crest. Lars let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He gave the signal to move on. As they descended into the deeper shadows of the valley, he glanced one last time at the star-dusted sky. He still couldn't see her. But for the first time, he was unequivocally glad she was there. The ambiguous presence was beginning to feel like a necessity. They were less than 2 kilometers from their final observation point, moving through a narrow, winding wash carved by millennia of flash floods. The rock walls rose steeply on either side, creating a natural choke point that felt both claustrophobic and menacing. Lars's senses were screaming. Every instinct told him this was a perfect ambush alley, a place where discipline and training might not be enough. He signaled for a halt, his team sinking into the sparse cover offered by boulders and cracks in the canyon wall. The attack came not from ahead, but from above. A sudden burst of automatic rifle fire erupted from the rim of the canyon, kicking up dust and stone chips just inches from Petrov's head. The sharp, distinctive crack of AK-47s echoed off the rocks, instantly multiplying the number of shooters. Before the echo died, a second enemy position opened up from the opposite side. They were caught in a classic L-shaped ambush pinned down in the kill zone. "Au contact!" Elias yelled, his voice tight, but controlled as he and Lars returned fire with short, precise bursts. "Multiple contacts, rimrock both sides." Petrov swung the heavy barrel of his M240 Bravo towards the most intense source of fire and squeezed the trigger. The machine gun roared to life, its deeper hammering report, a defiant answer to the enemy's lighter weapons. It bought them seconds, forcing the ambushers to keep their heads down. But it also made him a magnet for every bullet and grenade the enemy possessed. "Nearing, scribe, get the Sparrow on the line now." Lars ordered, firing another 2-round burst at a muzzle flash high above. He knew this was a losing fight. The enemy had the high ground and the numbers. They were being systematically encircled. Survival was no longer measured in minutes, but in the speed of the A-10. Elias was already scrambling, shielding his radio handset with his body. "Sparrow 1! This is Grim Actual. We are troops in contact, I repeat, troops in contact, pinned down in a ravine." The sound of ricocheting bullets was a sharp counterpoint to his voice. In the cold, dark peace of the stratosphere, the call was a jolt of pure adrenaline. Katerina's calm vigil was instantly shattered. "Solid copy, Grim," she responded, her voice betraying no alarm. She pushed the stick forward, and the Warthog tipped its nose towards the earth, shedding altitude in a controlled, rapid dive. Her screens came alive with data as she descended. 4 friendly beacons clustered and stationary, and around them a sudden bloom of more than a dozen new hostile signatures. It was a chaotic mess, a hornet's nest. "I have you on sensors, Grim," she said, her voice a lifeline of calm in their storm of violence. "But this is a furball. I can't get a clean shot. Talk me in. I need a target." On the ground, a machine gun opened up from a fortified position on the ledge above its heavy rounds, chewing up the rock cover Lars was hiding behind. This was their biggest threat. It had them completely suppressed. "Sparrow, I have a target for you," Lars yelled into the handset, which Elias pressed to his ear. "Do you see the flat-topped butte to our north? There's a machine gun nest on a ledge halfway up. It's our primary threat." "I see multiple heat signatures on that butte, Grim." Katarina's voice came back strained by the G-forces of her dive. "I need specifics. I can't risk hitting you." This was the moment, the nexus of trust. He had to give her a target she could see an anchor in the chaos. His eyes scanned the rock face, desperately searching. "There's a rock formation shaped like a clenched fist. Do you see it?" There was a pause. Katarina now screaming through the ravine at over 300 knots. Her eyes flicking between her canopy view and her targeting pod, had seconds to find it. "I see a fist," she confirmed. "Target is 10 meters to the right of the fist," Lars shouted. 10 meters right. Danger close. I repeat, danger close." Rolling in, cleared hot, the Warthog seemed to appear from nowhere, a monstrous shadow that blotted out the stars. It was impossibly low, its engines screaming. For a terrifying second, Lars thought she was going to hit the canyon wall. Then came the sound. The air didn't just split, it vaporized in the face of the GAU-8's fury. The Chatir was a physical blow. The machine gun nest on the ledge vanished in a storm of high-explosive incendiary rounds, rock and bodies thrown into the air. The effect was immediate. The linchpin of the ambush was gone. Robbed of their heavy support, the remaining enemy fighters' fire faltered. Within a minute, they were melting away into the darkness. Silence returned to the canyon, thick and heavy smelling of ozone and fear. Katarina's voice steady as a rock cut through the quiet. "Grim actual report status. Good hits." Lars took a ragged breath, looking at the smoking crater where their death sentence had been written moments before. He keyed the mic. "Solid hit, Sparrow. You saved us. We are clear. Repositioning now." "Grim out." He didn't wait for a reply. He gave the signal, and his team began to move, pulling back from the kill zone. But as he ran, he glanced up at the sky. The A-10 was gone already, climbing back to its lonely perch. It was no longer an abstraction. The pilot was no longer a voice. The Sparrow was their guardian, and for the first time Lars Hauk fully believed it. The shift in the atmosphere was subtle at first, a change in the tenor of the wind. It lost its dry, dusty edge and began to carry a damp, biting chill that seeped through their layers of gear. Lars, pausing to scan their back trail, noticed the sky to the west was no longer clear, but had taken on the bruised, leaden color of an old wound. The stars vanished, swallowed by a rapidly advancing ceiling of cloud. "My scribe, what's the weather update?" he asked, his voice low. Elias checked his tablet, his brow furrowed. Sat weather showed a low-pressure system, but it was supposed to track south of us. This is moving too fast. It's intensifying. Within 20 minutes, the wind was a physical force, a howling gale that tore through the ravine, forcing them to lean into it just to stay upright. Then came the snow. It wasn't the soft, picturesque snow of winter postcards, but a hard, granular sleet that stung any exposed skin and immediately began to coat the rocks in a treacherous layer of ice. Visibility dropped from kilometers to a few dozen meters, then to less than 10. The world shrank to a swirling vortex of white and gray. For the team, the mission was now secondary to survival. Their high-tech camouflage was useless in the whiteout. The cold was a tangible enemy, draining their strength and threatening the batteries that powered their communications and optics. They were blind, and the objective, the insurgent compound, was now completely obscured. More importantly, the storm was creating a wall of static, making their connection to the outside world, to their guardian in the sky, increasingly tenuous. "We need to find shelter," Lars yelled over the wind's roar. "Now, Echo, find us a cave, an overhang, anything." High above, Katarina saw the storm not as snow, but as a monstrous living entity. She had been tracking the weather system on her radar, watching with growing alarm as it defied meteorological predictions and swelled into a behemoth. It was a solid wall of black and crimson on her screen, a churning mass of ice, wind, and lightning. She was flying parallel to its leading edge, the A-10 bucking and groaning as it was battered by the outflow turbulence. Ice began to form on her wings, a creeping white crust that threatened the delicate physics of lift. The thump-thump of the de-icing systems kicking in was a grim reminder of how quickly the sky could turn from a sanctuary into a tomb. Her advanced targeting pod was useless. Its infrared sensors could not pierce the dense frozen moisture. The 4 friendly heat signatures she had watched so diligently had disappeared from her screen, lost in the overwhelming cold mass of the storm. All she had left were their GPS beacons, 4 tiny green dots about to be swallowed by an ocean of red. Then a voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the static on the command frequency. It was Colonel Davies. "All air assets, all call signs, this is command. A severe and unforecasted weather front is covering the Zagros range. All flight operations are now red light. You are ordered to return to base. I repeat, all assets are to RTB immediately. Acknowledge." The order was unequivocal. It was not a request. To fly in these conditions was to court suicide. Every protocol, every regulation, every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to obey. A pilot who flew into a storm like this was not brave. They were reckless and likely dead. Viper 3, acknowledging RTB, so a fighter pilot on a different patrol channel responded immediately. Condor 1, solid copy, returning to the field, came another. The radio fell silent, waiting for her. Katarina stared at her screen. The 4 green dots representing Grim Team were at the very edge of the storm's digital footprint. In minutes, they would be inside it. To leave now would be to abandon them completely. They would be alone, blind and freezing in the heart of enemy territory, with no eyes in the sky and no hope of fire support or extraction. The seed of trust that had been planted during the firefight felt like a lead weight in her stomach. Her professional duty was to obey the order. Her sworn purpose was to protect the men on the ground. For the first time, those two things were in direct, violent opposition. "Sparrow 1, acknowledge." Colonel Davies's voice repeated sharper this time, demanding an answer. Her hand rested on the throttle, her knuckles white. On her comms panel, the frequency connecting her to Lars's team was nothing but a hiss of static. They were already gone. She was alone with an impossible choice. The shelter Echo found was little more than a deep scar in the canyon wall, a wide rock overhang that offered marginal protection from the vertical assault of the snow. It was a desperate choice, but the only one they had. As they scrambled over the ice-slicked rocks to get inside, Petrov's footing gave way. The big man, burdened by the weight of his machine gun and ammunition, went down hard. The sound was not a cry of pain, but a sickening, muffled crack of bone that was somehow louder than the shrieking wind. Lars and Elias were at his side in a second. Petrov's face was a pale, sweat-sheened mask in the gloom. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle just below the knee. A compound fracture. Catastrophic. In this environment, it was a death sentence. They were no longer a mobile reconnaissance unit. They were a stationary wounded target. As Elias worked to stabilize the leg with a splint and morphine, Lars took up a watch position at the mouth of the shallow cave. His heart hammered against his ribs. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. He forced it down, replacing it with a cold, clear assessment of their new reality. They were trapped, immobilized. That was when he heard it. A voice carried on a sudden lull in the wind. It wasn't English. It was followed by another. The enemy hunters from the ambush, relentless and skilled, had used the cover of the storm to track them. The blizzard that had blinded the team had served as a cloak for their pursuers. "Jacob, I need that radio." Lars said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I need Sparrow. Get me a signal. I don't care how." The comms specialist was already working his fingers stiff with cold as he cycled through frequencies, trying to boost the signal. The small screen of the satellite phone offered no hope. No signal. The high-powered radio was just a speaker for the storm's fury, hissing with an impenetrable wall of static. "It's no good, Sergeant," Echo shouted, his face grim. "The storm's too thick and these canyon walls are blocking everything. We're completely cut off." Lars took the handset himself, pressing the transmit button. "Sparrow 1, this is Grim Actual. Do you read me? We are compromised. We have a man down, I repeat, we have a WIA. He released the button, listening intently. Nothing. Only the hiss of a dead frequency. The thin thread to the sky had snapped. At 20,000 feet, circling in the violent air at the storm's edge, Katarina felt each of Lars's unheard transmissions like a phantom limb. She had refused to acknowledge the colonel's order, buying herself precious minutes by pretending her own comms were failing in the weather. She kept hailing them, her professional calm fraying with each unanswered call. "Grim Actual, this is Sparrow 1. Report status. How do you copy?" The only reply was static. She watched the 4 green GPS beacons on her map display. They were flickering now, the signal struggling to penetrate the churning atmosphere. She was a physician watching a patient's EKG begin to flatline. She pleaded with the indifferent electronics. "Stay with me. Don't go out." Then, one by one, they blinked out of existence. First Echo, then Petrov, then Elias, and finally Lars. The space on her map where they had been was now unnervingly blank. They were gone. Not just out of contact, but erased from her digital world entirely. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. It was a vacuum, an absolute void where 4 lives had just been. Colonel Davies's order to return to base echoed in her memory, a voice of reason from a world of safety and procedure that no longer seemed to exist. That world had rules and regulations. This world, the one where 4 men were trapped and bleeding in a blizzard while being hunted, had only one rule: survival. She knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the ice on her wings what that silence meant. It was the sound of hope dying. It was the sound of men who were out of time and out of options. Staring at the blank screen, Katarina realized her choice had already been made. To obey her orders was to sign their death warrant. To turn her back now was not just abandoning a mission. It was an act of execution, and that was a line she would not cross. "Sparrow 1. I will not repeat myself again. Acknowledge the order to RTB now." Colonel Davies's voice was no longer just authoritative. It was a blade of ice cutting through the static-laced frequency, leaving no room for interpretation. This was her last chance to be a good soldier, to follow the chain of command, to save her career. In the turbulent cockpit, Katarina stared at the blank space on her map where 4 lives used to be. The logical part of her mind, the part forged in thousands of hours of training and simulations, screamed at her to obey. Flying into a supercell storm in a low and slow attack jet was a textbook definition of suicide. She would be risking a $90 million aircraft and her own life for a team that was by all logical metrics already lost. To disobey a direct order in a combat zone was an act of terminal insubordination. She would be stripped of her wings, disgraced, and imprisoned. But war was not always logical, and her reasons for being in this cockpit in this specific aircraft had never been about career progression. Her gloved hand tightened on the stick, and the cold metal seemed to draw a memory from the depths of her soul. The air was different then, thick with the heat of the Nevada desert. She was a lieutenant, fresh-faced and still wrestling with the brutish, unforgiving nature of the A-10. Beside her, walking along the flight line under a blazing sun, was Alexei Rook Volkov. He was the only other pilot in their training wing who seemed to understand the Warthog's soul. While others craved the speed of Vipers, Alex loved the stubborn resilience of their plane. "They don't get it, do they?" He'd set a wide grin on his face as he patted the nose of an A-10. "They see an ugly, slow pig. They don't see the truth." "And what's the truth, Rook Chateau Manal?" she had asked, playing along. He grew serious, then his gaze becoming distant. "We're not Knight's Cat. That's the F-16s, jousting for glory at 30,000 feet. We're shepherds. We fly in the dirt and the mud. Our flock is down there on the ground, surrounded by wolves. Our only job, our sacred job, is to make sure the flock gets home. All of them." He had turned to her, then his blue eyes intense. "Promise me, Sparrow. No matter what, you never ever leave the flock behind." She had promised. A week later, Alexei's engine failed on a low-level gunnery run. There was no time to eject. He hadn't died in a blaze of glory fighting wolves. His plane had simply failed him, and he'd become another name etched onto a memorial plaque. The promise she made to him, once a piece of idealistic banter, became a vow. It became her creed, the core of her identity as a pilot. It was why she flew. The memory faded, leaving the cold reality of the cockpit and the howling storm in its wake. The choice was gone. There was no dilemma. Colonel Davies was a voice from a world of regulations and acceptable losses. Alexei was the voice in her heart, reminding her of the sacred duty. She was a shepherd, and her flock was dying on the mountain. With a calmness that felt absolute, Katerina Rostova reached forward. Her fingers bypassed the communications panel, moving instead to a small guarded switch. It was the frequency toggle for the command channel. With a decisive click, she severed her link to Colonel Davies, to the base, to the entire world of reason and regulation she was leaving behind. Silence. The only voice left was the roar of her engines and the howl of the wind. She banked the A-10. The turn was slow, deliberate, a movement of immense weight and finality. The nose of the Warthog, ugly and resolute, swung away from the clear skies of safety and pointed directly at the churning black heart of the storm. The aircraft shuddered as the first violent tendrils of the supercell grabbed it, a beast trying to tear it from the sky. Katerina's eyes were fixed on her instruments, on the last known coordinates of Grim Team. She was flying blind, flying on instruments, flying on a memory. She was flying on a promise. The shepherd was going into the storm to find her flock. The storm did not welcome the Warthog. It consumed it. One moment, Katerina was flying through violent turbulence on the edge of the system. The next, she was plunged into an utterly blind, churning chaos. The world outside the canopy vanished, replaced by a strobing, disorienting whiteout as lightning flashed within the clouds. All sense of up, down, and horizon was gone. Vertigo clawed at the edges of her perception, a primal urge to trust her failing senses over the steady, glowing lines of her instruments. She fought it, locking her eyes on the attitude indicator. That small digital gyroscope was now her only truth, her sole anchor to reality. The sound was a physical assault. Hail and ice hammered against the armored glass with the sound of 1,000 furious fists. The airframe groaned under stresses it was never designed to endure, the wings flexing and vibrating with a terrifying intensity. A cascade of alarms began to shriek in the cockpit, a symphony of impending doom. Icing, stall warning. Not today. Katerina whispered, her voice a hoarse rasp. Her hands and feet danced on the controls, a constant fluid struggle against the storm's malevolence. She wasn't piloting the A-10 anymore. She was wrestling with it, forcing it through the brutal air by sheer force of will. She was descending, following the downward slope of the terrain toward the team's last known coordinates. Flying into a canyon system in a blizzard was an act of madness. But she had spent hours studying the holographic topographical maps, burning every ridge, every cliff face, every twist of the valley into her memory. She was no longer flying by sight, but by a three-dimensional map she had built in her own mind. Her radar altimeter became her eyes, its numbers fluctuating wildly as she screamed over unseen ridges. 300 feet, 200, 100. The ground proximity warning system erupted, its synthesized voice a frantic scream. Terrain, terrain. Her mental map told her there was a sheer cliff wall to her right. She pushed the stick, left a firm, committed movement, trusting her memory over the alarms. The A-10 shuddered, groaning in protest as it was forced into a tight, blind turn. For a terrifying second, she felt a sickening lurch she knew was a wingtip vortex interacting with a solid surface. She had missed the rock face by mere feet. Pull up, pull up! Again, she had to choose between the machine's warning and her own memory. The map in her head showed the canyon ceiling was low here, but the floor was about to drop away. Pulling up would smash her into the overhang. She held her course, her knuckles white, her body rigid against the crushing G-forces. The alarm blared, a frantic, desperate plea. Then silence as the canyon floor fell away beneath her, just as she had memorized. This was a new kind of flying. It was an intimate, terrifying dance between technology memory and pure instinct. The Warthog, true to its nature, took the beating. It was a stubborn, resilient beast, and it refused to die. Katerina could feel its strength, its sheer unwillingness to be torn apart, as if the machine itself shared her purpose. It was a guardian, and it would not fail its pilot. After what felt like an eternity of this brutal, blind struggle, she felt a subtle shift. The turbulence eased from catastrophic to merely violent. The hammering of the ice on her canopy lessened. She broke through a layer of cloud and into a pocket of relatively clear air at the very bottom of the canyon. She was in the eye of the needle. Below her, a world of swirling snow and jagged black rock unfolded. She was here. She was at their last known location. Her thumb found the transmit button, her heart pounding with a desperate hope. A grim actual, this is Sparrow. She broadcast on the team's frequency, her voice raw and strained. If you can hear me, talk to me. I am in the valley. Repeat, I am in the valley. How do you copy? She listened, the only sounds the whine of her engines and the howl of the wind outside. She was broadcasting into the void, hoping for a miracle. Inside the shallow cave, hope was a dwindling resource. Petrov had drifted into a morphine-laced stupor, his breathing shallow. The cold was relentless, a physical ache in their bones. Outside, the storm raged, but through the curtain of swirling snow, they could now see them, fleeting dark shapes moving methodically closer. The wolves were closing in on the wounded flock. They were checking their ammunition, preparing the last of their grenades. This was to be their final stand, a meaningless, anonymous death in a frozen canyon. Lars watched Echo lower the radio handset, his face a mask of defeat. "Nothing, Sergeant. It's dead." Something inside Lars, the cold, pragmatic core of the soldier known as Grim, refused to accept it. To die here, pinned and unheard, was an unacceptable failure. He moved to Echo and took the handset from his numb fingers. It was an act of pure, irrational defiance. He keyed the mic, his thumb pressing down hard, as if his physical pressure could force the words through the storm. He didn't shout. His voice was raw, stripped of all military formality. "Mayday, mayday, mayday! This is Sergeant Lars Hauk Grim Team. We are under siege. Position, overhang on the north-facing wall. My man is down. We are out of time." He paused, taking a ragged breath. Coordinates: 34 degrees, 43 minutes north, 66 degrees, 18 minutes east. He released the transmit button, the hiss of static returning like a final mocking laugh. It was done. A final prayer to an empty sky. In the cockpit of the Warthog, the static was a solid wall of noise. Katarina's hope was fading, turning into a cold dread. She had been too late. The storm had won. She was about to bank the plane to make another pass, when a flicker of sound, a ghost of a voice, pierced the hiss. It was impossibly faint, shredded by the storm. She strained, turning up the gain on her headset, until the static was a roar, trying to isolate the thread of human speech buried within it. "Is Grim surrounded. Petrov is down." The words were like an electric shock. Katarina's hand flew to her console, her fingers tapping furiously, trying to triangulate the faint signal. He was there. He was alive. 34 degrees, static, 43 minutes north. She scribbled the numbers on the small kneeboard strapped to her leg, her heart hammering. The signal was a flickering candle in a hurricane, but it was enough. More than the words, it was the tone that struck her. This wasn't the calm, collected NCO from the earlier firefight. This was a desperate plea, the voice of a man with nothing left to lose. The professional wall between them didn't just crack, it vaporized. He wasn't Grim Actual anymore. He was Lars. The signal died, swallowed again by the static. But she had it. A partial coordinate, a desperate voice, and a location. She plotted the numbers on her digital map. A single red dot appeared perilously close to a sheer cliff face, exactly where an overhang might be. A fierce, protective energy surged through her. Her purpose, which had been adrift in the storm, was now a razor-sharp point. She keyed her mic, praying the storm would grant her a moment of clarity to transmit back. "Lars, this is Sparrow, I hear you. I have your coordinates." She shouted, her voice a stark contrast to his faint whisper. She deliberately used his name, a promise that this was no longer just a mission. "I am on top of you, but I can't see anything in this. Light it up for me. Give me a target. Talk to me, Lars. I am here." Back in the cave, her voice boomed from the radio's small speaker, impossibly clear, for a few brief seconds. It was so loud, so full of strength, it felt like a hallucination. The four men froze. Lars stared at the handset, as if it had just performed a miracle. Hope, fierce and blinding, flooded the space. He scrambled through his gear, his frozen fingers fumbling with the clasp of a pouch. He pulled out a small gray block, their last IR strobe, a beacon visible only to her night vision and targeting systems. Activating it was the ultimate gamble. It was a pinprick of light that would say to her, "Here we are." But it would also guide the enemy to their exact position. He didn't hesitate. It was no longer a gamble. It was an act of absolute faith. He flipped the switch. A tiny, invisible to the naked eye pulse of infrared light began to blink from the mouth of the cave, a desperate heartbeat in the overwhelming dark. The infrared strobe was the faintest thing in a universe of chaos, a single rhythmic pixel of hope in the monochrome green of Katarina's targeting display. But it was there. It was real. It pulsed with a steady, desperate beat, a lighthouse in the storm. Locking onto it, her systems immediately highlighted the area, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The wolves were at the door. A cluster of at least 10 hostile heat signatures was swarming the beacon's location. They weren't meters away. They were feet away, converging on the mouth of the overhang, preparing for the final assault. There was no room for error. A bomb would obliterate the entire cliff face team included. A missile's blast radius was too wide. There was only one option, a tool of brutal, terrifying precision. The gun. "Lars, I see you." Her voice was unnaturally calm, a pilot's mask of control, hiding the storm of calculations within. "I see them. They are on your doorstep." She took a steadying breath. "I'm coming in from the north parallel to the cliff face. A strafing run. When you hear me, get as deep as you can. I say again, hug the rock." In the cave, her voice was a prophecy of imminent, violent salvation. Lars didn't need to be told twice. "Deep, get deep!" he roared, shoving Elias and Echo toward the back wall of the shallow cave. He threw his own body over the wounded Petrov, trying to shield him, making himself as small as possible. He pressed his face into the cold, damp rock, squeezed his eyes shut, and prayed to a god he wasn't sure he believed in. He had done all he could. Control was now an illusion. Their survival was in the hands of the woman in the storm. Katarina throttled up, forcing the protesting Warthog into a tight, impossible turn within the canyon's confines. The storm fought her, trying to throw her off course, but her focus was absolute. Her world had shrunk to the glowing symbols on her heads-up display. The IR strobe was the anchor point, the friendly position. The cluster of hostile signatures just beside it was the target. The space between them was no wider than a breath. She lined up the shot, her thumb resting on the red trigger on her control stick. The pipper, the cannon's aiming reticle, settled over the enemy cluster. Her heart was a cold, steady drum. She trusted her machine. She trusted her skill. But most of all, she trusted Lars's coordinates. She trusted him to be exactly where he said he was. "Guns, guns, guns." She whispered a final confirmation to herself. She squeezed the trigger. On the ground, the world ended. There was no warning, no sound of the approaching jet over the storm's howl. There was only the sound of the Avenger's arrival. It wasn't a noise. It was a physical event that tore the fabric of reality. The brrr-tau was a solid wall of sound that hit them like a physical blow, a continuous, deafening explosion that vibrated through the rock, through their bones, through their very teeth. The ground just outside their shelter erupted. The 30mm high explosive incendiary rounds, impacting at a rate of 65 per second, turned the rock and the men standing on it into a vaporous red spray. The concussion wave blasted into the cave, a hurricane of dust, debris, and superheated air. The noise was so immense, so overwhelming, that it became a perfect, ringing silence. The run lasted less than 3 seconds. In the cockpit, the Warthog bucked and shuddered, as if it were a living thing unleashing its primal fury. Katarina held the trigger, her entire body rigid, then released. She immediately pulled back on the stick, forcing the heavy plane up its engines, screaming as she fought to avoid slamming into the far canyon wall. Then silence. A profound, ringing silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the hiss of the snow and the fading echo of the cannon. Slowly, Lars lifted his head. He was covered in a thick layer of rock dust. His ears screamed. He looked at his men. They were alive, stunned, but alive. He crawled to the mouth of the cave and looked out. The area was a scene of utter devastation. The ground was blackened and shredded, smoking in the falling snow. There was nothing left of the enemy force, not a trace. They had been erased from existence. The strike hadn't been meters away from them. It had been inches. His hand trembling reached for the radio handset. He keyed the mic, but for a moment no words came. Only a choked, ragged breath of awe and disbelief. The ringing in Lars's ears slowly subsided, replaced by the howl of the wind and the hiss of falling snow. The silence left behind by the cannon's roar was absolute, a vacuum where the enemy's final frantic shouts had been. He remained crouched at the mouth of the cave, staring at the cauterized earth outside. It was not a scene of battle. It was a scene of judgment, as if a vengeful god had momentarily reached down and swiped the ground clean. His training, a lodestar in the chaos, finally reasserted control. He turned from the devastation without and looked to the life within. Elias and Echo were pushing themselves up, their faces pale with shock, but their eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous relief. He crawled over to Petrov. The big man was conscious, his eyes glassy from pain and the morphine, but he was alive. Lars's body had shielded him from the worst of the concussive blast. 4 men, all accounted for, all alive. He reached for the radio handset, his movements slow and deliberate. What could he say? Thank you felt insultingly small. Good hits was a grotesque understatement. Words failed him. He pressed the transmit button, and a single guttural word escaped his lips, carrying the weight of everything he could not express. Clear. High above, Katerina completed her sharp climbing turn and rolled the Warthog back around her eyes, glued to the thermal display. The relief that flooded her senses was so potent it was nauseating. The angry swarm of hostile signatures was gone. In its place was a dissipating cloud of thermal energy, a hot scar on the cold rock. And inside the overhang, the 4 friendly beacons she had memorized, the 4 signatures she had gambled everything for, remained. They were huddled, but they were whole. Lars's one-word transmission came through sharp and clear. Clear. She understood the novel of meaning packed into that single syllable. We are alive. The threat is gone. Because of you. She did not reply with words. Her actions would be her answer. Instead of climbing back to a safe altitude, she kept the A-10 low, throttling back to the edge of a stall. She settled the aircraft into a slow, tight, protective orbit directly above the canyon, her wings banking steeply around the team's position. The roar of her engines echoed off the canyon walls, a constant, defiant proclamation. I am here. I am watching. Nothing else will touch you. It was a promise made of jet fuel and thunder. On the ground, they heard it. The sound wasn't the scream of a fast pass, but the steady, reassuring rumble of the engines. Lars looked up. Through the swirling snow, he could see her, a dark, circling shape, a sentinel making her rounds. She hadn't fled. She was staying. She was guarding them. In the cockpit, a new light began to blink on Katerina's console. It was amber then, a steady, insistent red. The master caution light. On her fuel display, the numbers were critically low. Bingo. She had only enough fuel to make one attempt at the dangerous flight home. Her protective orbit had cost her dearly. She could stay for only a few more moments. She allowed herself one last circle, a final silent reassurance. Then she dipped a wing in a gesture, as old as aviation, a salute, a farewell. She pushed the throttle forward, and the reassuring rumble swelled into a powerful roar. Lars watched as the dark shape climbed, accelerating with purpose, until it was swallowed once more by the storm's impenetrable veil. The sound of her engines faded, leaving them in the wind and the snow. They were alone again. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of survival of a debt too profound to ever be spoken. It was the silence of a bond forged in thunder and ice between the flock on the ground and the guardian who had refused to leave them to the wolves. The flight back was a desperate knife-edge battle against fuel gauges and physics. Katerina wrestled the battered Warthog through the dying tantrums of the storm, every alarm on her console screaming about the state of her fuel, her hydraulics, and her ice-laden wings. She landed on the Kandahar runway, not with grace, but with controlled violence, the tires smoking as they met the tarmac. The engines spooled down with a final gasping whine, just as she cleared the active runway, her tanks completely, utterly dry. She expected the ground crew. Instead, she was met by a grim-faced Colonel Davies and two armed Air Force Security Forces airmen. They didn't speak. Their presence was the entire conversation. The moment her feet touched the ground, she was a pilot no longer. She was a prisoner. In the sterile silence of the colonel's office, the weight of her actions settled in. Davies stood by the window, his back to her, the rigidity of his posture radiating a cold, profound anger. You took a $90 million asset, flew it into a supercell storm against a direct lawful order, and shut off your communications. He said, his voice dangerously level. You are lucky to be alive, Captain, and you are even luckier that I haven't already had you formally charged and confined. Give me one reason why I shouldn't. Katerina stood at attention, her gaze fixed on the wall behind his head. She was exhausted to the bone, but her voice was steady. I had 4 reasons, sir. They were on the ground, wounded and about to be overrun. She offered no further excuse. The facts spoke for themselves. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it. Davies turned his face a mask of stone. There is a line between bravery and recklessness, Captain. There is a reason we have a chain of command. You crossed that line. Before he could continue, there was a firm knock on the door. An aide entered, looking flustered. Sir, excuse the interruption. Sergeant Hawk of Task Force 11 is here. He insists on speaking with you. It's regarding Operation Serpent's Tooth. I am in a debrief, Davies snapped. He says it cannot wait, sir, the aide insisted. With a sigh of profound irritation, Davies gave a curt nod. The door opened, and Lars Hauck stepped inside. He was out of his field gear, dressed in a crisp, clean uniform. He moved with a slight stiffness, but his eyes were clear and burned with an intensity that immediately seized control of the room. He gave the colonel a sharp salute, then turned his gaze on Katerina. It was a look of profound, unwavering solidarity. Sir. Lars began, his voice respectful, but leaving no room for argument. I have just completed my initial AAR, but I was told Captain Rostova was grounded pending an inquiry. I am here to provide my testimony on that matter. Davies gestured impatiently. Proceed, Sergeant. Lars took a step forward. Colonel, my team was in a zero survivability scenario. We were caught in a blizzard, one man with a compound fracture with no communications, and an enemy force moving in for the kill. We were dead. Not likely to die. We were already dead. He painted the picture not with military jargon, but with raw, vivid detail. He described the sound of the enemy voices on the wind, the futility of the radio, the taste of absolute despair. Then we heard her voice. He set his gaze, shifting back to Katerina. She flew into a storm that should have torn her plane apart. She found us when we were invisible. She was our eyes, our weapon, and our hope. The rounds from her cannon, sir. They impacted less than 5 meters from my team's position. 5 meters. In a whiteout blizzard in a canyon at over 300 knots. That wasn't a strafing run. That was an act of surgical artistry under impossible conditions. He took a final step toward the colonel's desk. The professional mask of Grimm was gone, replaced by the fierce loyalty of a man who had been brought back from the brink. Saxikaltru. Colonel Davies' Captain Rostova did not disobey an order to abandon her post. She refused an order to abandon her men. She upheld the highest duty any soldier has. What she did out there was not insubordination that needs to be punished. It should be etched into the history of this wing as a legend of what a pilot is supposed to be. She is the only reason I am standing here and not lying frozen on a mountain with the rest of my team. The room fell silent. Colonel Davies stared at Lars, then at Katerina. The cold anger in his eyes was gone, replaced by something complex and deeply human, a flicker of awe of understanding. The man of rules was confronted by the man of results, and the results were 4 living soldiers who should have been dead. Lars gave Katerina a short, sharp nod. It was a gesture of immense respect, a final silent word that said everything. I had your back. Katerina, who had been prepared to lose everything, felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. Her act of defiance had not ended her career. It had defined it. A few weeks later, the pre-dawn air at Kandahar tasted the same, yet everything had changed. As Katerina walked toward the flight line, the familiar sense of isolation that had always been her shadow was gone. The Viper jocks, once a clique of casual disdain, now met her eyes, offering nods of profound, unfeigned respect. The ground crews who serviced her A-10 looked at her differently, a hint of awe in their professional deference. Whispers followed her, not of the solitary woman who flew the ugly plane, but of a new burgeoning legend, the Sparrow of the Zargos Valley. She neither encouraged nor deflected the attention. She simply accepted it as part of the new landscape. She had not sought a place in their tribe, but in the crucible of the storm she had earned one. Her Warthog stood waiting in the soft light, its rugged lines looking less like a beast and more like an old, trusted friend. There were new patches on the fuselage, neat squares of metal covering the worst of the storm's scars. She ran her gloved hand along its side, the same ritual as always, but the gesture was different now. It was no longer a silent plea for reliability, but a shared acknowledgement of survival. They had gone into the abyss together and brought each other back. Strapped into the familiar armored confines of the cockpit, she began her pre-flight sequence. The practiced flow of flipping switches and running diagnostics was a comforting meditation. The world outside the canopy was beginning to glow, the distant mountains silhouetted against a sky blushing with the first hints of orange and pink. It was a new day. Just as she was about to call the tower for taxi clearance, a small cyan light blinked on her multi-function display. It was an incoming message on a secure encrypted channel, a frequency she had programmed into her system after the mission. The sender ID was not a standard military designator. It simply read, Grim. She opened the message. It contained only 3 words. Good morning, Guardian. A smile touched Katarina's lips. It was not the thin, controlled line of professional courtesy she usually wore. This was a true smile, one that reached her eyes and filled them with a light that had not been there before. The title was not a call sign assigned by a commanding officer. It was a name given to her by the men she had sworn to protect. It was the highest honor she could ever conceive of receiving. It was the fulfillment of her promise to Alexei, a final quiet validation of her entire existence as a pilot. She typed no reply. The message was not a conversation to be continued, but a statement of fact to be understood. With her checks complete, she sealed the canopy, and the muted sounds of the airfield faded away. Tower Sparrow 1 is ready for takeoff, she said, her voice clear and calm. The clearance came, and she guided the A-10 onto the runway. She pushed the throttles forward, and the twin engines spooled into a deep, earth-shaking roar. The Warthog surged ahead, gathering speed, its heavy frame shedding the inertia of the ground. With a final graceful pull on the stick, she lifted into the air. The plane climbed not with the brutal vertical aggression of a fighter, but with a steady, resolute power. She banked towards the east, her wings catching the first golden rays of the rising sun. Below, the base shrank away, and the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the war spread out before her. She was no longer a lone pilot, an outsider in a borrowed sky. She was part of something larger, a link in a chain of trust that stretched from the heavens to the earth. She was a shepherd, a reaper, a promise keeper. She was the Warthog's guardian, and she was flying into the dawn. The official after-action report for Operation Serpent's Tooth was a masterpiece of military understatement. It spoke of unconventional tactics, acceptable deviations from protocol, and a successful outcome under extreme environmental duress. Medals were awarded, commendations were filed, and the institutional memory of the armed forces moved on as it always does. But reports never tell the real story. Legends do. Months later, and half a world away, Lars Hauck stood on the porch of a small wooden cabin watching snow fall gently on a forest of pine. The air was clean and cold, and the only sound was the wind. His leg had healed, leaving him with an ache that reminded him he was alive. Petrov, after 3 surgeries, was learning to walk again. They were all home. Sometimes a commercial airliner would trace a thin white line across the vast, empty sky, and Lars would find himself looking up, his gaze lingering long after the plane was gone. For a man who had only ever trusted the ground beneath his feet, the sky was no longer an empty space. It was a place from which the impossible could descend. A place guardians lived. At a dusty airbase in Arizona, the sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of fire and rose. Captain Katerina Rostova leaned against the fuselage of a Warthog, watching a new class of trainees perform their final checks. The whispers of her legend had followed her home, the Sparrow of Zagros, the pilot who flew into the storm's heart. They called her the Guardian. To the young pilots who looked at her with a mixture of fear and awe, she was an icon. But to her, the title was simpler. It was a promise made to a dead friend long ago that had finally been kept. They never spoke of the storm again, she and Lars. There was no need. Their worlds had diverged, and their duties had sent them down different paths. But the bond remained unspoken and unbreakable, a silent acknowledgement that existed across continents. It was a truth forged in the absolute zero of a hopeless moment, that trust is the only armor that truly matters, and that some debts can never be repaid, only honored by the quiet act of living the life that was given back to you. And sometimes, in the worst places on earth, under the darkest of skies, a soldier finds not death or glory, but the one thing they were truly meant to be.